Somewhere in the back of your memory, there might be a smell you cannot quite name. Steam rising off a stovetop in August. Something sweet and sharp at the same time, a little like vinegar and a little like fruit, with a low, warm note underneath that you only ever found in one kitchen. It came from a kettle on the stove, and the woman standing at it had her sleeves rolled up and her attention fixed on the jars lined along the counter like amber soldiers. She did not measure much. She did not explain much. She just knew. That kitchen held 20 kinds of knowledge that most of us will never recover. Not because it was secret, but because nobody wrote it down in time. This video is about 20 of those recipes. 20 things that came out of Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch canning traditions. Things that fed families through hard winters for generations, and then went quiet. Let us start at the beginning. Apple butter. Apple butter made in a copper kettle is not a recipe most people have encountered. What they have encountered is a product called apple butter in a jar from a supermarket shelf, and the two things share a name and almost nothing else. The real preparation began outdoors over a wood fire, with a copper kettle large enough to hold 30 or 40 gallons of apple mash. Pennsylvania Dutch families in Lancaster County gathered bruised apples from the orchard floor and brought them to the fire together because the stirring could not stop for the hours it took. Some families placed silver coins in the bottom of the kettle so the stir could feel whether the paddle was hitting copper or coin, a check against burning. When the mash turned from pink to brown to a deep brick red mahogany and stopped spreading when dropped onto a cold plate, it was done. Tradition traces back to Limburg and the Rhineland and arrived in Pennsylvania with German settlers. The community kettle events disappeared along with the copper kettles themselves. Corn cob jelly. Corn cob jelly sounds like the kind of thing you would make up to fool somebody, and in fact, that was part of its pleasure. The jelly is made from bare cobs left after sweet corn is stripped of its kernels. Boiled in water for 35 to 40 minutes until the liquid turns faintly yellow and carries the ghost of corn sweetness, strained through cheesecloth and set with pectin and sugar into a spread that tastes unmistakably of honey. Not like corn exactly, but like what corn remembers. The practice was well established in Amish and Mennonite homesteads across the Midwest and Pennsylvania by the 1880s, where nothing that could become food was discarded. One early description called it corn cob honey, made from material everyone else was throwing into the compost. Once whole kernels were frozen rather than stripped and canned, fewer cobs accumulated in the kitchen, and the knowledge of what to do with them faded inside a single generation. Canned venison in tomato broth. Canned venison in tomato broth was the quiet workhorse of Amish pantries in deer country. Cubed venison was packed raw into quart mason jars with salt, pepper, garlic, and a ladleful of tomato juice, then processed in a pressure canner at 10 pounds of pressure for 90 minutes. What came out was fork-tender meat sitting in a dark, silky broth that itself was worth keeping. In Amish communities across Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, Holmes County, Ohio, and Elkhart County, Indiana, the fall deer harvest went directly into the pressure canner rather than a freezer, because freezers were not part of the household. The venison could be eaten cold on bread, heated into a stew, or added to soups, and it carried no gamey sharpness because the pressure processing mellowed it completely. When residential freezers became affordable in the 1950s and the 1960s, canning meat came to feel like extra labor rather than essential labor, and the pressure canner moved to the back of the cabinet. Watermelon rind pickles. Watermelon rind pickles required a patience and a philosophy that are both rare now. The firm, white rind, trimmed close to the green skin and cut into uniform pieces, was soaked overnight in salt water to firm the texture, then cooked in a boiling syrup of cider vinegar, sugar, cinnamon sticks, whole cloves, and allspice until each piece turned translucent and absorbed the sweet, warm brine. The finished pickle was neither entirely sweet nor entirely sour, and its texture fell somewhere between a pickle and a candied fruit. A 1974 recipe book called Plain Cooking documented a version called Rosy Watermelon Pickles that included maraschino cherries in the brine, turning the liquid pink. At Amish markets in Lancaster County, the jars can still occasionally be found, but almost no one makes them at home. Modern seedless watermelons have significantly thinner rinds than the older seeded varieties the recipe was built around. A frame of mind that used every part of a food is one the supermarket age actively discouraged. Chow Chow. Chow Chow was never about a single recipe. It was about a principle. At the end of summer, after the main harvest was in and before the first hard frost, Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch families gathered whatever was left in the garden and turned it into one final jar. Green tomatoes too small to ripen, the last of the green beans, a few peppers, some cabbage, cauliflower heads that would not survive the cold. Everything was chopped, salted overnight, drained, and cooked in a sweet-sour vinegar brine with mustard seed and celery seed until it became bright, tangy, and specific to that year's garden. No two batches were identical. The name may derive from the French word chow for cabbage, though the connection is not certain. The relish was served alongside heavier winter meats, its acidity cutting through fat in exactly the way the Pennsylvania Dutch sweet-sour tradition demanded. When supermarket relishes appeared on shelves for less than the cost of the ingredients, the end-of-season logic that created Chow Chow stopped making sense to most households. Pickled red beet eggs. Pickled red beet eggs were born from a frugality so complete it became its own recipe. After a batch of home-canned pickled beets was opened and the beets were eaten, the vinegar brine was not discarded. Hard-boiled eggs went in. They sat for 2 to 3 days, absorbing cider vinegar, sugar, and clove until the whites turned deep burgundy purple all the way through, and the flavor became sharp, sweet, and earthily satisfying in a way a plain boiled egg never managed. The practice was documented as a Lancaster County staple and confirmed across Pennsylvania Dutch cooking sources as a frugal extension of the beet canning tradition. The logic was absolute. If you canned the beets, you had the brine, and wasting it was unthinkable. The recipe did not survive the decline of home beet canning. When families stopped putting up their own beets, the brine ceased to exist, and the eggs were never pickled again. That deep purple cross-section, startling and beautiful on the plate, disappeared with it. Pear honey. Pear honey had a name that told you exactly what it was supposed to do. Peeled, diced pears were cooked slowly with sugar, grated lemon zest, fresh lemon juice, and ground ginger until the fruit softened and the syrup thickened around it into something dense and golden. It was not quite a jam because the fruit was too present. It was not quite a butter because it was not smooth. The Pennsylvania Dutch Cookbook of Fine Old Recipes listed it as a distinct preparation worth its own entry, a sign it was made often enough to require documentation. Pear harvests in Lancaster and Lebanon counties in the 19th and early 20th centuries were large enough that a bushel of pears needed to be processed quickly or lost, and pear honey was one efficient answer. Today, pears are sold ripe at the grocery store and consumed within days, removing the urgency that made preservation necessary and the abundance that made a whole batch worth the labor. Green tomato mincemeat. Green tomato mincemeat looks like a contradiction until you understand what mincemeat actually meant in a plain community kitchen. This version contained no meat despite the name. Green tomatoes pulled from the garden at first frost were combined with diced apples, raisins, brown sugar, cider vinegar, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and allspice. The mixture was cooked until thick, dark, and deeply spiced, then packed directly into quart jars for use as pie filling through the winter. Lancaster County had a particular attachment to mincemeat, and the Lancaster Online Archive contains dozens of regional recipes, including meatless green tomato versions. The timing of the recipe was tied to the agricultural calendar in a way that made cultural sense. You made it when the frost was coming, and the green tomatoes had to come inside. When that calendar was no longer a living reality in most households, the recipe had no moment left to occupy, and the pie shelves filled with something else entirely. Harvard beets have a name that sounds borrowed, and a flavor that is entirely their own. Unlike plain pickled beets in a simple vinegar brine, Harvard beets were canned in a thickened sauce of sugar, cornstarch, and cider vinegar, cooked first into a glossy liquid that set around the beet slices like a translucent glaze. The finished color was a deep garnet that moved on the spoon. The name is believed to reference the crimson of Harvard University's athletic colors, and preparations matching the description appear in American cookbooks as early as the 1890s. Laura Ann Lapp, an Amish author from central Pennsylvania, listed Harvard beets as a distinct preparation in the book Amish Canning and Preserving, separate from pickled beets, because in the tradition, they were genuinely different foods with different roles at the table. The thickened sauce step confused a generation of canners trained only on brine recipes, and the dish disappeared from American side dish culture by the 1980s without much notice. Canned mincemeat with beef. Canned mincemeat pie filling made with real beef was a butchering day recipe in Lancaster County Amish homes, tied so completely to a specific moment in the farming year that it barely survived the year farming stopped being central. Ground beef and beef suet cooked with apples, raisins, brown and white sugar, warm spices, and sweet cider were packed into quart jars the same day the cattle were processed. A former member of a Lancaster County Amish community described it on the Amish Heritage website. Her mother canned mincemeat pie filling every time they butchered a cow, and when she was gone, the recipe went with her. Did your grandmother make this one? Did she can it at butchering time, the real kind with beef and suet? Tell me in the comments, because this is one of the recipes that went quieter than almost anything else on this list. The whole category collapsed in mainstream American food culture during the 1970s and the 1980s as younger generations found the combination genuinely unfamiliar. Pickled cantaloupe. Pickled cantaloupe sounds improbable, and that is exactly why it worked so well at the Pennsylvania Dutch table. Firm, slightly underripe cantaloupe was cut into cubes and packed in a spiced brine of cider vinegar, sugar, cinnamon sticks, and whole cloves. As it rested, the melon absorbed the sweetness and warmth of the spices while holding its shape, becoming tender but not soft, translucent but not dissolved. The experience, Pennsylvania documentation of Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine, is specific about where it belonged. Pickled cantaloupe paired with chicken. Not with everything, with chicken. That deliberateness, the tradition of pairing specific preserved foods with specific meats, was what made each jar a precision instrument rather than a generic condiment. Modern supermarkets sell cantaloupe fully ripe and ready to eat immediately, which means sourcing underripe melon for pickling requires deliberate effort. That barrier alone is enough to explain why the recipe slipped away. The ingredient it needed no longer existed in the form required. Rendering and canning lard. Rendering and canning lard was not an afterthought in Amish kitchens. It was one of the central acts of the butchering season. Fat from the pig was cut into small pieces, rendered slowly over low heat until it melted completely, and the cracklings could be skimmed out, then strained hot through doubled cheesecloth into heated mason jars, where it sealed as it cooled, turning from clear liquid to pure white solid. Shelf-stable, rendered lard stored this way lasted through the winter and served as the primary cooking fat for pie crusts, frying, and baking. Crisco shortening arrived on the American market in 1911 and was aggressively marketed as a cleaner, more modern alternative to animal fat. By the 1960s, A sustained nutrition campaign against saturated animal fats had removed lard from most American kitchens. The rehabilitation of lard by food writers in recent decades brought it back to some restaurant kitchens, but the practice of canning it at home has not followed. Elderberry jelly. Elderberry jelly was not something you bought. You found it first. The berries grow wild along fence rows and creek banks throughout Lancaster County and the broader Pennsylvania Dutch region, small and dark and clustered on stems so fine they had to be stripped with a fork before the fruit could be used. Amish families foraged them each August and September, simmering the stripped berries and pressing them through a jelly bag until the juice ran deep purple-black, almost opaque. With pectin and sugar, it set into a jelly with a layered, slightly floral complexity that no commercial berry product has ever matched. Laura Ann Lapp listed elderberry jelly in Amish canning and preserving as a standard annual variety alongside strawberry and grape, not a novelty. The knowledge of elderberry foraging and the careful handling required for the raw berry, because the raw berry is mildly toxic before cooking, was not passed on to a generation that had stopped walking fence rows in August, and so it went with them. Canned souse, which is pickled head cheese, is the recipe most likely to make a modern cook pause. The preparation began with a pig's head, split and cleaned, simmered for hours until the meat fell from the bone and the broth turned rich with dissolved collagen. The meat was picked off the bones and combined with the strained broth, seasoned with cider vinegar, salt, black pepper, and sage, then packed into jars while still warm. As it cooled, the natural collagen set the broth into a firm, sliceable meat jelly that could be turned out of the jar and served cold. Pennsylvania Dutch sources from the Grit magazine archive describe souse as a standard butchering day preparation, made from the parts that would create a jelly substance when cooked. The recipe's decline followed the end of whole animal butchering in farm households directly and without detour. When the head was no longer available because the family no longer processed their own hogs, souse simply ceased to exist. Green tomato relish worked because it asked nothing of the season that the season was not already offering. Every garden in October has tomatoes that will never ripen before frost, and leaving them on the vine meant watching usable food go to waste. The tomatoes were finely chopped with onion, sweet peppers, and celery, salted overnight, drained, and cooked in a brine of cider vinegar, mustard seed, celery seed, sugar, and turmeric until the mixture turned bright, firm, and pungent. Laura Ann Lapp listed it in Amish canning and preserving as a standard Amish relish, and the Pennsylvania Dutch cookbook of fine old recipes contained a version as well. The relish had no commercial equivalent that preserved its particular sharpness. Once home, gardens shrank to the scale, where first frost volumes were small enough to compost without guilt. The recipe had nothing to work with, and the last sharp smell of turmeric and vinegar in October went with it. Spiced whole pears. Spiced whole pears were canned for the table the way most people now think of cranberry sauce, as a deliberate accompaniment to a specific meat. Firm pears, peeled and left as whole halves or quarters, were simmered in a pickling syrup of cider vinegar, sugar, cinnamon, cloves, and allspice until they turned clear and absorbed the spice deeply. The Pennsylvania Dutch cookbook of fine old recipes documented the preparation, and Amish America's canning recipe archive confirms its place in Lancaster and Dauphin County tradition. The spiced pear went next to the ham or the pork roast, its sweetness and aromatic warmth balancing the salt and fat of cured meat in exactly the way the tradition intended. The problem was not that spiced pears are difficult to make. It is that the entire serving context, the ritual of setting a bowl of preserved fruit alongside a roast, disappeared from American dinner tables. And without that context, the recipe had nowhere left to go. Canned pawnhouse. Canned pawnhouse or scrapple pressed into jars, extended butchering day across the entire winter. The preparation began with a pig's head and bones, simmered until the broth was thick with collagen and the meat could be picked clean, then combined with the ground meat, cornmeal, buckwheat flour, sage, and mace, and cooked until the mixture thickened to a stiff, pulling consistency. Poured into mason jars and pressure canned, it could sit on a shelf for months, then be turned out into a loaf pan to firm overnight and sliced for the cast iron in the morning. Scrapple, known in Pennsylvania Dutch as panthouse or pawnhouse, is documented as originating with German colonists near Philadelphia and Chester County in the 17th and 18th centuries. Commercial producers later made the product available in refrigerated cases, and the need to can it at home diminished alongside the need to butcher at home. What the jar preserved was not just the food, but the morning it was made for. Canned ham and bean soup. Canned ham and bean soup was the complete meal in a jar before that phrase was a marketing concept. Navy beans soaked overnight were cooked with a meaty ham hock until the beans were tender and the broth turned thick, smoky, and dark. The soup was packed into quart jars with broth, beans, and pulled ham, processed in a pressure canner and stored. Opening a jar in February meant a full meal required only a pot and a few minutes of heat. Laura Ann Lapp listed ham and bean soup as a standard Amish pressure canning preparation, and multiple Amish meat preservation guides confirm its place as a whole meal jar staple. Commercial canned bean soup, marketed aggressively from the 1940s forward and priced well below the cost of home production, undercut both the economics and the perceived necessity of making your own. When the convenience alternative cost less than the labor, most kitchens made the trade, and the particular depth of a home-canned broth became a memory. Pear butter was the last jar of the season in many Amish pantries, and its making marked the end of the canning year, the way the first strawberry jam had marked its beginning. Ripe Bartlett pears, or the small, intensely sweet Seckel pears native to Pennsylvania since the early 19th century, were cooked for hours with sugar, lemon, and cinnamon until the fruit broke down completely and the pulp reduced to a smooth caramel-edged spread with a depth that applesauce could not reach. Laura Ann Lapp listed pear butter as a distinct sweet spread in Amish canning and preserving, separate from pear honey and standard preserves. The Seckel pear, the traditional choice for its concentrated sweetness, was largely removed from commercial agriculture by the mid-20th century in favor of larger, more shippable varieties. As pear trees were cleared from farmsteads, the abundance that made pear butter necessary disappeared with them, and this last jar of the season quietly stopped being made. 20 recipes. 20 reasons to understand that what the Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch canning tradition preserved was not just food. It was a relationship between a household and its land that required knowing when the frost was coming, what to do with what the season left behind, and how to make something worth opening in February from what the garden offered in October. Find a source for Seckel pears this fall. They are still grown in small orchards across Pennsylvania and the Midwest, and they are still the right pear for pear butter. Cook them down with sugar, lemon, and a cinnamon stick until the spread barely moves in the pot. Put it in a jar. That is where this knowledge lives now, in the making, not just the remembering.